Well, good afternoon. Happy Sabbath. We're going to begin this study this afternoon with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the study of your word. We are thankful, Lord, for the things that you teach us. And we are thankful for the time that we live in, that we can see the events in this world as they move towards the culmination, as they move towards the end of all things. And we are grateful that we can participate in this, that we can understand the things that are happening around us, and that you've entrusted us with a message to give to the world, and a message that will also transform us. We pray for our church, for this movement, for those that are seeking light. And we just ask, Lord, that as we study together, that you can give us light to encourage and strengthen your people. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, good afternoon. And we're going to be going through Klaus Schwab's book, COVID-19 and the Great Reset. I have here the PDF of it. I also have it in a hardcover. Oops, sorry about that. It's probably a loud noise there. But I have it there in the hardcover as well, or not hard, soft cover. I have it in print. It's a pretty depressing book for a number of reasons. One is you can see the direction that the world is going. Now, last night we had looked at the UN. So we had looked at the chronology of the start of the UN, but not a lot of details about the UN, which I still would like to get into. I'm trying to understand the United Nations better, its history. And we also had looked at Revelation chapter 13. And I'm going to bring this up here. So here's Revelation chapter 13. And we had addressed this issue of the mark of the beast, and that there is the mark, the name of the beast, and the number of his name, and that no man might buy or sell, save that he had the mark of the beast, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Now, I'm taking that as three different manifestations of this mark. I know that it could also be understood that it's called the mark, but it's also the name of the beast, and it's also the number of his name, that all three of these things are the same thing. And in a sense, they are. But we can see that they manifest themselves differently depending upon the person's commitment to these things. That is, some people have the mark of the beast, and maybe all of these people have the mark of the beast who are going to be able to buy and sell. And we've talked a bit about what that means. But some have the name of the beast. Some have the name of the beast, and some also have the number of his name. It is, I don't think that everyone who has the mark of the beast is included in all three of these. But I could be wrong, but this is the way that I'm understanding it. And we know that the number of his name, which is a number of a man, the number of the beast, was understood by William Miller as being a period of time. That is, it connected pagan Rome with papal Rome. And he was using the League in 158 BC and connecting that to 508 AD, so 666 years inclusive. Now, we also know that when it comes to the United Nations, we have understood Revelation 17 in this movement. We've understood that these 10 horns, which are 10 kings, represent the United Nations. And they have received no kingdom of yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. That's Revelation 12 or 17, verse 12 and 13. Now, we've talked in some of our other studies about the differences between the beasts in Revelation 12, 13, and 17. And so I'm not going to go into all of that. But one thing we see is that there's no crowns upon either the horns or the heads in the beast in Revelation 17. But these 10 horns, which are represented in each of the beasts, here they become more the focus, in the sense that they're going to all be combining with this other head that is the eighth. And this eighth head, how we understand this, whether we understand this as Joseph Bates did, as being the United States when they're in the time of the Sunday law, or whether we understand it in some other way. That is, what we do see clearly is that these are all united at the end time. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. Now, when it comes to understanding the beast, what is the beast? Which beast is it referring to? Because we have the beast of Revelation 12, we have the beast of Revelation 13, which both have 7 heads and 10 horns. We have the 2-horned beast, and we also have the beast of Revelation 17. So when it's talking about the beast, who is it talking about?
Rome.
Okay, so Rome, what Rome?
Technically, it'd be Rome papal, but it is still strictly Rome.
Okay, so it's papal Rome, and we know that papal Rome is just a different manifestation of pagan Rome. It's clothed in Christian garb, but it's really still paganism, right? As Seventh-day Adventists, we understand that papal Rome is not truly Christian. It's a new form of paganism. It's dressed up as Christianity, but it still has the same sentiments that we have in paganism. So the beast here, and we have these different beasts. So if we look at the beast here in Revelation 17, in verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Who then is the woman?
Wouldn't it be the Roman Church?
Okay, so it'd be the Roman Church. So when we're talking about the beast here, we can't be talking, when it talks about the beast here later, it can't be talking about the beast of Revelation 17. That is, it would be talking about the beast of Revelation 13, because the beast of Revelation 13 is papal Rome, right? Because this has been one of the issues in understanding these passages. So we have a great red dragon, that old serpent, the devil and Satan, right? We have, that's Revelation chapter 12. And we have the first beast, which is the one that is a composite beast, and one of the heads is the papal head, correct? Going back to our studies on.
Yes, agreed.
Okay, so in Revelation 17, we see a different beast. The woman is riding this beast, right? So we know that this great whore that's going to be talked about in verse 1, with whom the kings of the earth had committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So we're going to be shown this. And so he shows us this by showing this scarlet colored beast that's full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and a woman is riding this beast. That is, she's committing fornication with this beast, which is the kingdoms of the earth, as you can see as you read through chapter 18. It's quite clear when it talks about this. So when it talks about the beast later in Revelation 17, the beast that was, is not, and even he is the 8th and is of the 7 and goeth into perdition, in Revelation 17, verse 11. This must be referring to the beast of Revelation 13. Or would somebody make the case that it's referring to the beast of Revelation 17?
Well, question I must ask,
Yeah.
is it possible that we're dealing with the woman, the religious power of Rome,
Mm-hmm.
riding upon a beast, which is the civil power of Rome?
Right. And so the civil power of Rome would be the United States, would it not? And the kingdoms of this world. Would it not?
I'd have to really think about that.
Okay. Because it is one of the problems that we dealt with, at least we addressed as a question, but we never had a really solid answer on that. That is, there are very different views that people have. The pioneers had a different view than this movement has regarding these beasts in some details, mostly much the same. But when it came to the beast of Revelation 17, I think it's hard to say that the beast is both the Roman Church and the woman is also the Roman Church. You can't have it both ways. The beast here has to be the civil powers that exist, the governments of this world, and this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. So the woman has to be different from the beast itself. Now, we can say that one of the heads is a papal form of government, which is what the pioneers held to. That is, they had that these heads represented forms of government. So they would refer to the state. But here, we're going to have the 10 horns that are going to have power. That is, it's not the heads that are going to have power. So in Revelation 12, let's just go back there. We remember in Revelation 12, the crowns upon the 7 heads, right? That's 12 verse 3. Having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. In chapter 13, in verse 1, it says, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. So the crowns now are upon the horns. But in chapter 17, no crowns are mentioned. But these 10 horns are going to have power 1 hour with the beast. They receive no kingdom as yet, it says, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So they're not being shown with these crowns, neither the heads nor the horns. But there's going to come the time when they receive a kingdom. That is, they receive power as kings for 1 hour with the beast. And these would be the kingdoms of this world. So we take this as being the United Nations. Now, we had a bunch of questions that we discussed last night, talking about how the United States gets to the point where it goes contrary to its constitution. that republicanism and Protestantism are both repudiated, and the Constitution is repudiated. That the United States is no longer Protestant nor Republican when it exercises its speaking as a dragon. That's when it speaks as a dragon and brings about the Sunday law. And we dealt with some of the things like abortion and the conflict between the federal and the state legislatures or governments. And I don't know if I fully understand everything about the United States government and how it operates, but I do know that the intentions of its founders was that the federal government had very little power, and even the states themselves had quite limited power. The Constitution was meant to limit the power of the state. And one of the roles of the federal government was to see that the Constitution was upheld by the various states, and that state power didn't overstep the bounds of the Constitution. So there was lots of checks and balances put in place. But it was noted by some of the founders that they didn't believe the republic was very stable, because it would require that the members of the republic, the citizens, act in a certain way. That is, because so much power was really given to the individual, if the individual would change their values, then really the state itself could do nothing to stop that change. And it would readily take over and receive power from the people that the Constitution did not allow. So one of the things we saw with the pandemic, and we've seen this in other situations as well, 9/11, people will trade freedom for safety, even if it's imaginary safety. That is, human beings are going to act not always in their best interest. But the idea that the state is going to act in our best interest is a dangerous illusion. The state has no interest in you. And yet, this is what is often being sold to us, that the government knows what's best for us, and that the government has to come in and protect us from ourselves. This is the idea of the nanny state. So I'm pretty sure most of us are familiar with these ideas. Now, what I want to look at then, I just wanted to go through those, that foundation there. And again, we haven't answered all of these questions completely. But in this book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, this is on the PDF format, it's page 117, but it's actually not the same page in the book. And in the book, it's it's chapter 3, I believe. Yeah, it's going to be under this title of, let me see if that's really where I wanted to start. I think this is under the environmental, I think this is under the chapter of business, but don't know where this is in this book. So I don't know the page, but anyway, if you look at the PDF, which I did send out, you can see this. Now, he had published this book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution. So we're going to look at this here. I just got to share this. It's under a section called Technological Reset. So the idea is that technology has this role. So in his book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, He made the case that technology and digitization will revolutionize everything, making the overused and often ill-used adage, "this time is different," apt. Simply put, major technological innovations are on the brink of fueling momentous change throughout the world. Besides the fact this is really bad English, in the sense of it's not very clear. What does the word revolutionize mean? Why is he using the word revolutionize? What's the idea behind that? Anybody?
Away with the old and in with the new.
Out with the old, in with the new.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this idea of progress, that everything's going to get better.
He's attempting also to get an emotional response from his readers,
Yeah.
because he wants his readers to think that the current system needs to be overthrown.
Right. So he's going to point out this, and this section here dealing with the technological reset. He's trying to write in a way that is not making people too fearful. That is, he's trying to show that he's considering the dangers of technology as well. But when he gets into the next section, which is dealing with individual reset, you can see where his sentiments lie, and you can see it here as well. But so they're dealing with technology. So this is before the pandemic. This is 4 years before the pandemic, when the Fourth Industrial Revolution was published. And what they were looking at is technological progress. And he says, in the 4 short years since technological progress has moved impressively fast. So one is that we're supposed to be impressed by it, and we're supposed to see technological change as progress. And then he says, AI is now all around us, from drones and voice recognition to virtual assistants and translation software. Our mobile devices have become a permanent and integral part of our personal and professional lives, helping us on many different fronts, anticipating our needs, listening to us, and locating us, even when not asked to do so. Automation and robots are reconfiguring the way businesses operate with staggering speed and returns on scale in speed and returns on scale inconceivable just a few years ago. Innovation in genetics, with synthetic biology now on the horizon, is also exciting, paving the way for developments in the healthcare that are groundbreaking. So you can see he's using a lot of these worn out sort of expressions, groundbreaking. When you see this type of language, it really doesn't mean anything, but it's meant to sound positive, right? That's the intent of it. Biotechnology still falls short of stopping, let alone preventing, a disease outbreak, but recent innovations have allowed the identification and sequencing of the coronavirus genome much faster than in the past, as well as the elaboration of more effective diagnostics. In addition, the most recent biotechnical techniques using RNA and DNA platforms make it possible to develop vaccines faster than ever. They might also help with the development of new bioengineered treatments. So it sounds pretty wonderful, eh? To sum up, the speed and breadth of the Fourth Industrial Revolution have been and continue to be remarkable. This chapter argues that the pandemic will accelerate innovation even more. So that word innovation obviously has a different meaning than for him than it has for me. Anyway, catalyzing technological changes already underway, comparable to the exacerbation effect it had on other underlying global and domestic issues, and turbocharging any digital business or the digital dimension of any business. It will also accentuate one of the greatest societal and individual challenges posed by tech: privacy. We will see how contact tracing has an unequaled capacity and a quasi-essential place in the armory needed to combat COVID-19, while at the same time being positioned to become an enabler of mass surveillance. Now, so what's the problem here? What is it that is not being said in that section? Not being questioned, maybe I should say. I mean, when it comes to the pandemic, should the government have a role in public health?
Should the federal government have a role in public health?
Yeah, should the federal government or world governments, should it happen on such a large scale?
No.
Okay. So, I mean, a government can have some role in public health, but the decisions that are made for public health should be made on first on the level of the individual. That is, governments can inform us about information, scientific information, but definitely they should not be compelling us or controlling us or taking away our freedoms. And as we can see, this issue of the common good is one of the big problems that we see, that is an assumption made by Klaus Schwab and many like him. How do we define what the public good is? How do we define what good is?
Those are huge questions.
Yeah. And because do we know what's best for other people?
No.
No. And we can also take the value system. So some people may have the value system that the most important thing is that people are alive and healthy, that we should maximize the health of a nation, do everything that we can to protect life. Well, of course, they're not concerned about lives of the unborn, or really about lives of other people in the world, or really even concerned about the lives of the people around them. But at least on a sort of statistical basis, somehow the idea that we just are alive is what public health is about. But would you want to live in a society where your health was protected, but you had no freedoms?
I wouldn't.
I wouldn't either. Right. And, and we talked a little bit about this last night, the idea of, because you had mentioned it, Dwight, I believe, that some people believe that even I can never say the word.
Ectopic
pregnancies should be allowed, that you shouldn't abort even in those cases. Now, I don't know a lot about those types of pregnancies, what the survival rate would be, whether it's always a given that the woman is going to die or that the baby is going to die. I don't know. But I tend to be a little bit of a fatalist. That is, we live in an age in which man can intervene with technology to save lives, where 100 years ago, we couldn't. Does that mean our lives are better when we have this technology that can save lives? Is that what makes life better? Is that what our quality of life is based upon?
No.
How long we live? And one of the things I looked at some years ago regarding, because we always hear this statistic in 1900 that the average age that people lived was 40 years, something like that. Now, when a person became old, once they got through childhood, the average age that they would live is much more than 40. That is, people died in childhood. Childhood diseases is what, once you survive those childhood diseases, you would live actually, on average, a long, healthy life. Now, we've also increased the length of people's lives in the 20th century, but at the expense of morbidity. That is, people, when they had an illness and they were old, they tended to die rather quickly. That is, we didn't have the technology to keep old people alive for years and years and years. And so the amount of morbidity that people experienced before their death was much smaller. That is, people lived healthier longer than they do presently. That is, people aren't very healthy, but they can live a lot longer while being unhealthy. So we talk about these medical advancements, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to care for our health and take advantage of some of these at times, but we have to sort of accept the inevitable that we all die. Now, another thing that has changed, of course, is the fact that people have few children. So when I researched my family tree back in the 1970s, I found that there were most of my ancestors would have at least 10 children, often more, 14, 18. But they would often go through several wives, because often the woman, not often, but occasionally, a woman could die in childbirth. And so the man would then marry again and have more children with another wife. And how many of those children actually lived to adulthood was rather small. I mean, it wasn't like less than half, but it was something close to half, especially at certain times. So we know that people live longer on average, and that we don't have as much childhood death. And we also know that we don't experience death as often, especially, reading some old books. The idea that a baby would die or a mother would die, it was a very common experience, especially, if you're having, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 children, you're going to experience one of your siblings dying or more when you're young. So it changes our whole way that humanity looks at life, how we value life, how we make our decisions, what we think about. One of the things that we see is that people expect to live a long, healthy life. They expect to be prosperous. We are told that our lives are better than lives in the past were. And in some ways, we can see we have more luxuries. But is mankind happier? So there's this, this idea that all of these technological advancements have been to our benefit, and they can be useful tools. But when it comes to who man is and what man has always been since God created him, they've actually been, to a large degree, something that has hindered the character that God wants man to have. And so we can see when we have a prosperous nation, and we saw this with the Roman Empire as well. It was very prosperous, but it was also very profligate. There was all kinds of sin and corruption. And we see that today, that we have this privileged society that can't decide what a woman is. So when we talk about this progress, we can see that it's not really progress. Now, it talks here in this next section about digital transformation, that is, the technology of what we'd call tech. With the pandemic, the digital transformation that so many analysts have been referring to for years, without being exactly sure what it meant, has found its catalyst. One major effect of confinement will be the expansion and progression of the digital world in a decisive and often permanent manner. This is noticeable not only in its most mundane and anecdotal aspects, more online conversations, more streaming to entertain, more digital content in general, but also in terms of forcing more profound changes in how companies operate, something that is explored more in depth in the next chapter. Anyway, we're not going to deal with that too much. So in April 2020, several tech leaders observed how quickly and radically the necessities created by the health crisis had precipitated the adoption of a wide range of technologies. In the space of just 1 month, it appeared that many companies, in terms of tech take-up, fast forwarded by several years. So an example of this would be my son's guitar store when he still owned it. And he had just gotten his inventory online just before the pandemic hit. We had been working on it for about 6 months or so. Well, maybe actually really about, it had been about 6 months. A year before he had gotten the website, but he'd really started putting in this inventory. And that's what saved his business. Many guitar stores and music stores went under during the pandemic because they just didn't have enough sales. But his sales increased dramatically because he had the online business. And he had been planning to have about 10% of his sales online by the end of 2020. But really, it was more than 50% of his sales by the end of 2020 were online sales. And it's continued to be that case. So the changes happened. People are much more comfortable buying things online, even things like guitars, which I would never buy online. But people have had to buy them online, and they've just learned to adopt or adapt to that. Now, so that happened rather quickly. And these changes aren't going to be undone, right? We're going to still be more and more comfortable buying things online. So they're going to deal with this idea of all the different things that we do now online that we wouldn't have done before: e-learning, e-things, e-commerce, e-gaming, e-books, e-attendance. And of course, we know that in this movement, we've moved to online studies. We don't have a lot of in-person studies. Now, there's an advantage to that. Of course, we can study with people all over the world, which we couldn't have done before. And it's changed also our relationship with those around us. That is, I attend church less now than I would have had the pandemic not happened. So I don't go to church very often. So we know that some of these things are going to go back. People obviously are going to have social environments. We're not going to be locked away, which many people were. I never really felt that locked away during the pandemic, but some people definitely do. And we're going to see that, some people are still going, there's going to be changes in when you get sick, probably you're not going to go to work. Where in the past, if you were sick, you just went to work. Now you can't. And that's probably going to hang on for a while. Now, just seeing there was some things that I underlined here that I want to look at. Okay. Oh yeah, it's another section. Okay, I'm skipping this stuff here. I gotta zoom out to be faster. Okay, I want to deal with this thing of contract tracing. So one of the things that I don't know if any of you experienced it where you live, But in Alberta, they had this contact tracing. That is, you could get an app and put it on your iPhone. And of course, this information wasn't going to be stored by the government anywhere. I'm not sure how it worked. But I did have a guitar student who her job was actually to follow up this contact tracing. So if she would just deal with this online, she sat in front of a computer, and she would have to notify people that they had been in contact with someone who had COVID. That's basically was her job. Now, the dangers, of course, of this is you have governments tracing and tracking you. Now, do you think this is something that law enforcement would love to have?
I would think so.
Yeah, imagine if they could keep track of every person, where they were. If they had a murder, some crime, they could tell whether you were there or not. I mean, we know this kind of brings about this idea of a dystopia. Now, the question is, some people say, well, that's fine, because if you're doing something that's illegal, I mean, that would aid the police. But the question is, when do we decide that something is actually a crime? Because one thing we could see during the pandemic, and we're going to deal with this, I don't know if we'll get to this today, but how people act or behave can be interpreted differently. That is, is a protester committing a crime? How would you decide if a protester is desirable, that his protest is honorable or dishonorable? How is that decided today? Who decides? Because when we dealt with the protests that happened, the BLM riots, did the media look at those riots favorably?
Yes.
Okay. What about the truckers' protest?
No.
Okay. Which ones were violent?
The BLM.
Right. And yet it was portrayed as peaceful, even as you saw things burning behind you. And the truckers was seen as violent, even though it was completely peaceful.
Right.
Right. So if the state has that kind of power, and we saw this with the truckers, to actually close people's bank accounts based upon donations, you wouldn't want to give that type of power to the state. Even if it could be used for good, it can also be used for evil. Now, he's going to look at this contact tracing, sort of in a balanced way, at least in a way that he thinks is quite balanced. He's going to talk about the dangers of what could happen if these were, misused. So he says here, the most effective form of tracking or tracing is obviously the one powered by technology. It not only allows backtracking all the contacts with whom the user of a mobile phone has been in touch, but also tracking the user's real-time movements, which in turn affords the possibility to better enforce a lockdown and to warn other mobile users in the proximity of the carrier that they have been exposed to someone infected. Now, this to me is one of the most troubling aspects, because what are the assumptions underlying this whole paragraph?
that technology is for the public good.
Okay. Now, of course, we have this thing that we don't really know what that means, the public good. But is it really needed? That is, cannot people change their behavior if they feel that there's a risk without the use of technology? That is, we also would recognize that if you have technology and people feel that they're safe, and obviously here we're not really dealing with a true pandemic, what we experienced. But let's say you were in a pandemic where people were quickly dying of some communicable disease. People would naturally change their behavior. You don't need the state to come in and tell people what to do. And people, if you're having contact tracing, people would probably feel more secure in actually having contact with others, believing that they're safer. But that really wouldn't benefit them. That is, you could probably create greater risk by having this false sense of security. So everything changes the way we behave. And so there's no way that we can know that this technology is actually better. One of the things we can find is that contact tracing actually was not effective at all. The research that has been done on this shows that it did nothing to actually help in reducing the spread of COVID. So we had something that was potentially a danger, and that is it might have given overconfidence to people. Same thing with mask wearing. People might have a sense that they're safer when in reality they're not, because masks don't do anything, especially cloth masks. They do nothing to stop the spread of COVID, which we now know. But they did lots of studies quite early on showing that that was the case. But they still wanted us to wear masks. So when we look at these types of situations, what we see is that people are not aware of all of the effects of a decision that they make. You know, for instance, with COVID, it would probably have been better if no actions were taken by the government at all, and people were just allowed to make their own choices. The virus would have spread more quickly, and it would have changed differently than it did. That is, one of the reasons the virus became more contagious was why? Why did the virus become more contagious? What actions had occurred that caused the virus to become more contagious? Did slowing the spread cause the virus to become more contagious?
Yes.
And how does it do that?
Rather than letting it go through its standard progression, it basically wound up having a greater incubation type period.
Yeah, and the virus that the only ones that could spread, the only forms of the virus that could spread, were the ones that were the most contagious, right? Because it's still going to spread, but it's going to spread. If people had been more exposed to it, it wouldn't have become as contagious. Now, of course, hindsight's 50-50. It's hard to know exactly how things would have been different. But one thing we do know is that the virus has become extremely contagious because people have been social distancing, washing their hands. All these types of things would slow the spread of the virus, but make the ones that do spread the one that's going to be passed on and pass on its genetics, as something that's actually more contagious. So everybody is eventually going to get sick. The question is, how fast do you want them to get sick? Now, they wanted this idea that we would just, because the hospitals would be overwhelmed. But the simple solution to that would have been creating special places, and these could have been done because you had sporting arenas that were empty, all kinds of things that were empty, and you could have easily set up temporary hospitals dealing with people who were infected with COVID. So there was no reason that the regular hospital systems should be overwhelmed, and we saw this in the United States, in New York, where the military hospitals were set up, the boat, the military vessel to be used as a hospital, and they never even used them. Right? So there seemed to be something quite fishy about the whole thing. I'm not saying I'm a conspiracy theorist in that sense, but it wasn't really logical what was being done. This more had to do with controlling people than anything.
The more they could inject fear,
Mm-hmm.
the more they were able to control. Now,
Yeah.
in this situation, this coronavirus,
Mm-hmm.
is it as deadly as, say, rabies?
No, it's not.
Okay. Is it as deadly as, let's say, HIV?
No.
What about any of the hepatitis virus?
No, it's actually not a very deadly virus. I mean, it does, like a cold or the flu, affect people who are suffering from other illnesses, are much more likely to die than if they weren't sick. But there isn't a strong evidence that healthy people generally were going to die.
But in all of these situations that I just asked about,
Mm.
these are some of the most common human viruses.
Right.
Yet the focus has been on, we must give you an injection for something that is not as deadly as those that were just mentioned.
Right. Well, it's basically it's a misallocation of resources, for one thing. The amount of efforts put in to stop one problem while ignoring other problems isn't really to the benefit of everyone. But it was the popular problem, right? It's the thing that the media played upon. They could have chosen almost anything. I still take the position, if it wasn't for the media telling us about this, that most of us wouldn't even have noticed it. That is, if we had not had the ability to know that it was a coronavirus, we might have thought it was a bad flu year.
Exactly.
Right. Now, and we've had flus that are more deadly than COVID and affected younger people than COVID did. COVID, for the most part, affected those who were elderly and had comorbidities.
When you say comorbidity, please explain.
Well, they had illnesses that were leading to their death fairly
Thank you.
soon, right? So that means
Right.
they were going
So
to probably be dying within the next 2 or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. So they might have died a couple of years earlier, or a year earlier.
So they already had an underlying illness.
Yeah.
So COVID may have contributed, but was not the cause.
Right. It's not the cause. Now, I mean, there's lots that we don't know still, and there are problems with the analysis of it, because we have had the vaccine, and so people have been vaccinated and people have also had COVID, and we hear of long COVID, the idea that there is this aftermath of having COVID, but it's going to be hard to distinguish whether that's the cause of COVID itself or of vaccinations. Because we don't have a control group. We don't have a group of people who weren't vaccinated and have not been exposed to COVID, that haven't had COVID. But pretty much almost everybody has had both, or one or the other. People who are vaccinated, most of them are getting COVID because the vaccine, if it's effective, is only effective for a short term and not effective against all the strains of COVID. So, or the variants. Okay, so just dealing with some of these things about surveillance. It says the perennial concern expressed by legislators, academics, and trade unionists. Now, I'm not sure why, legislators, academics, and trade unionists are all mentioned in this sentence, but they are. So take note of that. Is that the surveillance tools are likely to remain in place after the crisis, and even when a vaccine is finally found, simply because employers don't have any incentive to remove a surveillance system once it's been installed, particularly if one of the indirect benefits of surveillance is to check on employees' productivity. Now, of course, what is the choice that we have if employer wants to constantly have surveillance of us? What choices, what decisions can we make to make that not beneficial for employers? Can't we just quit our jobs?
That's possible.
Yeah. So one of the things we see, though, is that people are willing to give up their freedom for safety, even if they don't believe in it. So it says here, this is what happened after the terrorist attacks of September 11. All around the world, new security measures like employing widespread cameras, requiring electronic ID cards, and logging employees or visitors in and out became the norm. At that time, these measures were deemed extreme, but today they are used everywhere and considered normal. An increasing number of analysts, policymakers, and security specialists fear the same will now happen with the tech solutions put into place to contain the pandemic. They foresee a dystopian world ahead of us. So the risk of dystopia. Now, what's a dystopia? Notice it's on page 126. What's a dystopia?
Notice it's on page 126. Way to go. A dystopian future, isn't that one where the government controls all efforts and all actions of mankind?
Well, it can be. There's different types of dystopias, but the idea is it's the opposite of a utopia. So utopia is an ideal world to live in. A dystopia is the opposite of that, a world that's not very ideal. And 1984 would be a dystopia. A Brave New World would be a dystopia. Animal Farm would be a dystopia. There's lots of dystopias that are written about. But the idea of surveillance,
You mean like
Big Brother's watching. Yeah.
You mean like the writings of Marx and Engels are a dystopia?
Yeah, well, they don't quite see it that way. They would see it more as a utopia, but
we have seen the results in those governments that chose to follow their writings.
So we believe that God created us to be free, and that there's consequences for sin, and that because of sin, man will die, that he's given us a means by which to care for our health, and that much of what the government is doing and imposing upon us is actually contrary to the laws of God. And that makes it a dystopia. One is, it's not going to really improve the world. People have these ideas of how they can make the world a better place. And that's really what 2020 or 2030 is about, the Great Reset, is that we're going to make this world a better place. It says here, dealing with COVID-19 and the power of technology, they will then be willing to give up a lot of privacy and will agree that in such circumstances, public power can rightfully override individual rights. Then, when the crisis is over, some may realize that their country has suddenly been transformed into a place where they no longer wish to live. It's kind of that way in Canada, but I mean, it can definitely get worse than that. But this is what has been happening. And some places in Canada, I mean, they're still wearing masks. They're still restricting travel, even though it's completely illogical. Now, why is it that the governments like having this type of power?
Because the more that they are able to control, the more they're able to monitor and direct the person or persons in the manner with that they desire.
Which would allow them to stay in power.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. So people who want to be in power, who are in power, want to be in power and want to stay in power. And that's all they're really interested in, for the most part. So there's another paragraph here. Surveillance technology is developing at breakneck speed, and what seemed science fiction 10 years ago is today old news. As a thought experiment, consider a hypothetical government that demands that every citizen wears a biometric bracelet that monitors body temperature and heart rate 24 hours a day. The resulting data is hoarded and analyzed by government algorithms. The algorithms will know that you are sick even before you know it, and they will also know where you have been and who you have met. The chains of infection could be drastically shortened and even cut altogether. Such a system could arguably stop the epidemic in its tracks within days. Sounds wonderful, right? The downside is, of course, that this would give legitimacy to a terrifying new surveillance system. If you know, for example, that I clicked on a Fox News link rather than a CNN link, that can teach you something about my political views and perhaps even my personality. But if you can monitor what happens to my body temperature, blood pressure, and heart rate as I watch the video clip, you can learn what makes me laugh, what makes me cry, what makes me really, really angry. It is crucial to remember that anger, joy, boredom, and love are biological phenomena, just like a fever and a cough. The same technology that identifies coughs could also identify laughs. If corporations and governments start harvesting our biometric data in mass, they can get to know us far better than we know ourselves. And they can then not just predict our feelings, but also manipulate our feelings and sell us anything they want, be it a product or a politician. Biometric monitoring would make Cambridge Analytica's data hacking tactics look like something from the Stone Age. Imagine North Korea in 2030, when every citizen has to wear a biometric bracelet 24 hours a day. If you listen to a speech by the great leader and the bracelet picks up the telltale signs of anger, you are done for. Now, of course, Cambridge Analytica was completely overblown. What they were doing, they were actually misleading people into what kind of power they had. But anyway, so all of this technology is something that we can't avoid. I mean, in the sense that technology keeps changing. And mankind is affected by that technology. So, an example. In the 12th century, they started to alphabetize knowledge. That is, prior to the 12th century, if you bought an encyclopedia, information was not arranged alphabetically, because prior to the 12th century, there were no spaces between words, which I find very odd, but that's the case. When language was written down, there were no spaces. And it was always meant to be read out loud. That is, you only read out loud. You did not read silently. But they began putting spaces between words, distinguishing which words were which, and to starting to organize information alphabetically. So instead of having lions and tigers and cheetahs all together, one after the other in a book, in an encyclopedia, lions would be in the L section, and tigers in the T section, and cheetahs in the C section of an encyclopedia. So it changed the way that man thought about information. Also, they began indexing books. So prior to that, if you wanted to know what was in a book, you had to read it. But once they had indexes, you could look and find information from a book and just read that information itself. And this is to the extreme in the present day. That is, people can find information. They can search through all of the books, the library of information that is the internet, and find information that agrees with them without understanding the context of that information. That is, people don't have to read books. They can read little bits of information here and there and have very little understanding of the topic. Now, of course, doesn't mean that that's the natural thing that the internet can do, or the only thing that the internet can do, because people can find entire books and read entire books online. But the thing is, many people now are not able to do that. That is, they've been trained to pick out information because there's so much information. And it's changed the way that we look at ourselves. Computers have changed how we look at ourselves, how we look at information. And so the technology of print itself has changed mankind. So technologies always exist, and they're always going to be changing, but they're not always going to make the world better. They're going to make it different. And man will have to adapt to those changes. And some of that adaptation is going to be negative. Now, I don't know if I talked about this before, but some people have analyzed the problem that we have in our society today with homosexuality, for instance. Now, I can't remember the name of the experiment, but it was where they created this ideal environment for rats. They also did it with mice. So that is, what was it called? These rat cities. They ended up with a change in behavior. So animals, like people, are not meant to be to have no challenges. That is, we all need challenges in order to grow and develop, to be healthy. If you provide all of our needs, what ends up happening to us? If I never have to make any efforts to provide for my basic necessities, what does that change?
Our very character.
Okay, our character changes. So we have this idea, well, to make things better, we're going to make it so that everything's much more accessible. I mean, even think about something like nuts. If you had to go out and gather some nuts and eat them, you would probably burn a sufficient number of calories. so that you wouldn't become overweight. But if all you do is eat nuts all day, you go out and buy big jars of cashews and eat cashews, you have a change where cashews are accessible, but you're not going to burn very many calories eating them, correct? I don't know if that's the best example.
It's an example.
It's an example. Okay. A better example would be, when I was
I
young.
would I
and
would have used pecans. Pecans.
because they're fatter, more fat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Well,
also, yeah, and you have to, of course, the same with walnuts. You have to crack the shells and get the walnuts out. But if they're already cracked for you, you're going to eat more, right?
right. I mean, let's, as you look at this, you've got pecan, you've got walnut, you have certain others that require some effort.
Yeah. Yeah, even pistachios. I mean, you have to kind of break them open and eat them. I mean, you could eat a lot of pistachios really quickly. But if they're already open for you, you could eat way more in the same amount of time with less effort. And that's kind of what's happened to our society. Everything is given to us on a silver platter. We actually live in a society of privilege. That is, we have privileges that our grandparents couldn't even have imagined.
I thought them kind of nuts was bad for you though.
I don't know if nuts are bad for you. I think
No,
nuts are
I'm talking about the ones you just mentioned.
pistachios.
Yeah, pistachios. I
I,
thought those I thought those bad for you.
I don't think so. Why
I
would they
don't
be bad for you? I mean, if
I
you
don't know. That's real. I'm just saying that's what somebody was telling me. I don't know if
no.
it was pistachios or was it it might have been pecan, not pecans, but
Walnuts.
peanuts that's in the ground. I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah.
the point here is that um, when I was young and I got married and I had children, I had to find work, and life was pretty difficult as a young person. I came into the job market at a time when we were in a recession, 1980s. I had to do a lot of things that I was not, that weren't very comfortable. I had to go door to door selling artwork. Went door to door selling vitamins. I had to do a lot of jobs that were pretty miserable for my personality because I'm very shy and introverted. So having to go door to door knocking on doors wouldn't be something I'd naturally do. But I learned by doing that uh, to learn how to communicate to people, to get over to how to deal with people, and of course I ended up doing my music door to door, and that was difficult. Selling my albums door to door was not fun. Every time I went out door to door, I feared going door to door, but I did it because I had to support my family. So if I had everything given to me, I would never have developed the communication skills that I have today. I wouldn't have started a guitar store and learned to deal with customers and to teach students, all those things that have enabled me to be able to do things like this, talking to people. When I became an Adventist, I couldn't even pray in front of people. I couldn't read in front of people. But because of necessity, I've had to develop and grow. And if you just provide everything for a person, they never have that opportunity to grow. And of course, this is true spiritually as well. If we don't have trials, if everything goes our way, do we need God? When have we turned to God? We've turned to God when we were at our wits' end, when there seemed no place else to turn, no place else to go. And so we live in a world like this rat city where you end up with all kinds of homosexuality, and actually you end up eventually with a type of asexuality. The rats just don't reproduce anymore. They're not interested. And we see this happening with our society. And part of it is the internet. So one of the things I think, this is my theory, is that when you have a very crowded world, it changes human behavior, sexual behavior, or interactions with others. And the Facebook and the internet has made the world a smaller place. It's in a sense made the world more crowded, even if it's not really more crowded. So people have changed their behaviors, and we are definitely heading to a dystopia. We're heading to a time in our world in which people are willing to have the state take care of them. They're willing to have their life easier. You know, what's one of the things that they've been pushing for? And they did this when they gave out this money at the time of the pandemic. You might have heard about it, but it was called what kind of wage? What is it, or not a wage, but what is it that they were wanting to do? I can't remember the word. Basically, everybody would get enough money to live on. What do they call that? Anybody know what I'm talking about?
Is it something like Social Security?
Well, it's not Social Security, but the idea is that everybody would just get enough money to a universal basic income. That's it. Thanks, Iran. So you probably heard about this. Now, what's the problem with the universal basic income? Basically, it's an allowance from the government.
And somebody else decides what your value is.
Okay. So, but you have your basic needs are met, right?
But you'd have to have a tax system to support it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, that's a whole other issue, you know, because eventually we're just going to have robots doing all the work anyway, right? I mean, that's the way they look at it.
It makes us lazy.
You become a slave dependent on your master to feed you when he or she decides to feed you and clothe you and do everything else for you.
Yeah. So it makes us dependent upon the government. It makes us lazy. It's like the kid that never leaves home. Is that psychologically healthy for a child who lives at home and never leaves mommy and is dependent upon his parents?
Heck, no, I got out when I was 16.
Yeah. But you know, if you have the state basically acting as this parent, you're going to end up with psychologically unhealthy people, which is what we already have. We have a whole generation of people that haven't the slightest idea of what work is, and think that an employer is just somebody taking advantage of them, not somebody who is giving them an opportunity. I had this even with one employee a number of years ago, about 20 years ago, who was a socialist. And, you know, even though I was making less money than him per hour, he thought that, you know, I was this greedy capitalist. So I was making like $1 an hour, and he's making, well, teaching guitar, he's probably making like $25 an hour. So, you know, so we have this idea that, you know, everything should just be given to us. And we, in a sense, had that a little bit, I think, when we were younger, you know, when we were teenagers, maybe. But as soon as we hit the real world wasn't going to just give us a living. But now people want that to be a reality, that the world does owe us a living. And so it becomes a great danger. Now I'm gonna skip some of this here. There's a lot of this is just kind of some of the business stuff, stakeholder capitalism, some of the things we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and industry, and these don't really affect us. Okay, I want to deal with this part, behavioral changes. And we're going to deal with this in a couple of weeks when we go through the individual reset and what that's about. But one of the things we know is that people's behaviors can change based upon circumstances, and they can be manipulated. An example I used before was there was a park in downtown Edmonton. There was lots of drug dealing and crime and prostitution. So they started playing classical music at that park, and of course, all the crime disappeared, moved somewhere else. But another example of behavioral change that is often not foreseen, and in economics we call it rent seeking. But I had this guitar student. She was about 19 years old, I think. So she was just out of high school, and her mother brought her in for guitar lessons. And she was about 6 months pregnant, I think, something like this, or maybe she'd just had a baby. I don't know. I can't remember exactly how that happened. I think she was pregnant at the time, if I remember correctly. But she had told me that all of her friends were getting pregnant, and they weren't telling, like they would claim that they didn't know who the father was. Because one is they didn't want the father to be involved in their lives. So they just found some good-looking guy who was willing to sleep with them and get them pregnant. And the reason they did this is because they could get a free education. Because if you're a single mother in Canada, you can get your education paid for. And of course, the government's going to take care of you. So why would you have to bother with some guy when the government's going to take care of you? And now the reason is they put this to help single mothers, but what it actually does is create single mothers. And so one of the things is that often the actions of the state distort the market, and they cause people to act in ways that really is not to their benefit. So we need to live in a world where life is difficult. We live in a world where life is difficult, but it's becoming less and less difficult all the time. And naturally, we're going to take the path of least resistance. That's human nature. So they're addressing here behavioral changes. Some behavioral changes observed during the lockdowns are unlikely to be entirely reversed in the post-pandemic era, and some may even become permanent. How exactly this will play out remains very uncertain. A few consumption patterns may revert to long-term trend lines comparable to air travel after 9/11, albeit at an altered pace. Others will undoubtedly accelerate, like online services. Some may be postponed, like buying a car, while new permanent patterns of consumption may emerge, like purchases associated with greener mobility. So there's this whole idea of this World Economic Forum, where they're trying to sort of control and predict what's going to happen. So they've looked at this pandemic as an opportunity, as they said in the first part of this book that we had read, that you're never going to let a, so to speak, a crisis go to waste, that they're taking advantage of this to push their agenda. Now, it changes education because people can go online and get education. So why would they be going to a university? But they say here, to grasp the extreme complexity and uncertainty of this evolution in consumer behavior, let us revert to the example of the online shopping versus in-person retail. As stated, it is very likely that bricks and mortar stores will lose out severely in favor of online shopping. Consumers may be willing to pay a bit extra to have heavy and bulky products like bottles and household goods delivered to them. Supermarket retail space will therefore shrink, coming to resemble convenience stores where shoppers go to buy relatively small quantities of specific food products. But it could also be the case that less money will be spent in restaurants, suggesting that in places where a high percentage of people's food budget traditionally went to restaurants, in New York, 60% in New York City, for example, these funds could be diverted to benefit urban supermarkets as city dwellers rediscover the pleasure of cooking at home. The same phenomenon may happen with the entertainment business. The pandemic may increase our anxiety about sitting in an enclosed space with complete strangers, and many people may decide that staying home to watch the latest movie or opera is the wisest option. So obviously people's behaviors change. How permanent these are. The one thing that they do know is that they can change people's behavior through fear. And who benefits from these large online shopping? Are these big companies or small companies generally?
Mostly
Large
the big ones.
Yeah, so big companies, right? Global companies. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad or good. I mean, we all like to buy, we like to pay less for things. We like things to be more efficient. But competition usually helps create more efficiency. The less competition you have, the more that we can be taken advantage of. So whether that's good or bad that people are doing online shopping, I don't know. I mean, for my son, it definitely helped his business. But it definitely changes our world. And it's mostly technology. The pandemic may have sped things up a bit, but in the long run, it's technology that is making these changes. And people, it's allowed governments and large corporations connected with the media to basically control people who aren't aware of what's happening. Now, we're going to deal with, in 2 weeks, we're going to deal with the chapter here having to do with individual reset. And it's probably the scariest part of this book. So I think I'm going to skip all this here. I'll just show you where we're going. So this is where we're going to be in 2 weeks. So people may want to read over this section of the PDF, which I sent out to everyone. Because I think this is where the problem really comes with how this whole pandemic has been spun, and really what their plans are, what they're trying to do with this pandemic. The other ones have to do with technology, and those things would be coming anyway. Technological changes always occur. But here, this idea of what the individual reset has to do much more with privacy, individual privacy, the choices that we make, and also the moral choices that are being made, and whether we're going to value the individual or the group. And governments, of course, aren't interested in the individual. They can't possibly be. You'd have to know the individual to really be concerned about them. People to them are more like cattle. Now you can have a farmer who has, a small herd and he knows each of his cows personally. And you can have a large industrial farm where the individual cows don't matter. What matters is the overall herd numbers. I don't know that you want to be a cow, but which cow would you rather be? The cow who knows its master, or the cow who is just a number in some large feedlot? I mean, the end's still going to be the same, probably, but you understand what I'm saying? Who's going to be more likely to care for you if you're sick or injured? So I don't know. I don't know how happy cows can be, but I can assure you that there would be some situations where they'd be much less happy and contented.
Well, it'd be like most small businesses, they care more about the individual than these big corporations
Yeah.
that you have.
And that's the attraction to small business. I mean, there's a reason why people like the Turner Guitar Studio, because when you walk in, you're treated with a friendly smile. You're never any pressure being put on you, and people are very happy. It's like a family. And where if it was just a large music store, I mean, you never know who you're going to meet when you go in, and usually it's a person who doesn't really care about you, probably is just watching the clock, and it's a completely different environment. So this is really where we're going to see some of the scary aspects of 2030 and what globalism means to the individual. That is, the individual rights get in the way of globalism. The one example I want to give, just to kind of close this, to sort of set this up a little bit. In my church in Warburg, we had a pastor come in. He wasn't a very good pastor. We had a good pastor before that, and this pastor came in, and he liked to push things through the board. And he wasn't really interested in, and when I say push things through, the board meetings had to be really short. He had an agenda. Basically, you vote on it, things get done. Of course, pushing things through a board, what's the problem when you push things through a church board? Do things get done?
Not always.
Yeah, well, basically nothing happens, because unless you have the support of the board members and of the church, the pastor can push something through, but he's not going to get any support on the ground, right?
Agreed.
Yeah. So one thing I always know is that if you're going to be a leader, one thing that you want to do is make sure that everybody knows that they have a voice. And the way our church used to work, and Lloyd would know about it, is basically you'd have a board meeting, and after the board meeting, the board members would go and talk to the church members about what went on at the board. And if there seemed to be that the decision the board made, that there was some unhappiness with it, the board would meet again and bring up some of these complaints. But the idea was that we had a church where people felt a part of the decisions being made. But once you have a church where decisions are made without consideration, because the church is a voluntary organization, people just don't support it. And I asked this pastor about it, and he said, well, it's too much trouble to talk to everybody. And there's always these people who are naysayers. And, I don't want to have to deal with them. It just takes too much time to communicate. Of course, he was foolish, because he never really accomplished anything in that church, in our church, because nobody ever supported what was going on. We had another pastor after him, same kind of idea, has an evangelistic series, nobody shows up. Well, what's the point? You have to be able, as a leader, to get people, a good leader who has a goal and a vision can get people to be behind him, because he's going to include others, and people are going to feel a part of what's happening. But we live in a world now where everything is moving away from the local level to the global level. And globalism is not our friend. No matter how much it tries to sell itself as more efficient, as more friendly for the environment, et cetera, in reality, it's more oppressive and more destructive. And that's one of the things that I see about 2030 is that they have this sort of utopia kind of idea of what the world can be, but the direction that they're going is actually destructive. And I think that's the actual intent in the end, is to really destroy this world, whether the people involved in it are aware of that or not. So hopefully this...
Well, they want to destroy the present system and then rebuild their own on it, which is mechanized and totally depersonalized. As long as they're the masters and the few they allow to live are their slaves.
Well, it's possible that's, but I would say that many people involved in this, going in this direction, don't realize where it's going. That is, they might believe and some people even believe their own propaganda, that the world is going to be a better place. But anyway, hopefully people learned something from the study today. It's, we know that God's in control, that he has foreseen all these things. And we've known that the world would be going this direction to some degree. It's just a little bit scary sometimes seeing that it's happening now. And what we need, of course, is to know God, and to know that he will take care of us. We have to be faithful to him. We have to develop a Christ-like character. We have to know how to minister to others. So I don't want people to get depressed about seeing what direction the world is going. And also not to be fearful, because we have nothing to fear for the future, except we forget the Lord's teaching and the way he has led us in our past history. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful for the Sabbath. And we know, Lord, that you have created us and this world. And that even though it is suffering under sin and will eventually perish, we know, Lord, that the purposes here, your purposes, will be fulfilled as we seek you. Help us to pray for those around us. Help us to study your word and to understand it and to be obedient. And help us to be an example to others. Help us to warn others about what's happening, as many people do see that the world is going in a terrible direction, but they don't have the answers. Give us wisdom in dealing with souls, that they can have confidence in you. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.